Ali, thank you so much for joining me today on the What is a Good Life podcast. Since hearing you appear on another podcast, and I'm very intrigued by your lines of inquiry, I was really curious to have this conversation with you today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Mark. It's a thrill. I've been following your work for a while, so it's a privilege.
So, as you are aware, we jump straight in with, is there a question you're exploring as you move through life?
Do you know, yes, I mean, I think there is. I would also say being asked the question is a rare thing, isn't it? I really appreciate the question because it does feel unusual to have a conversation at that register. I think the question that I'm probably exploring is something around how we can recover the capacity for right relationship with ourselves and with others and with the world, the living world, and possibly with the kind of the sacred or the divine in a world which is kind of systematically designed to keep us apart and keep us away from that. That's maybe the question. Maybe I'll refine that over time. I'll stop there, Mark.
Can you expand upon it though? This recovering the capacity for that right relationship, and perhaps maybe just where you first sense you were kind of coming into contact with that.
Yeah, gosh. Well, I'll first say I'm not someone who grew up really in right relationship to those things. I'm someone who grew up very much separated from nature. I grew up in a flat in a city in London. I had a single mother. We'd come from Poland via Germany, and we didn't really have community and we didn't have family. So it was like kind of me and my mom against the world, living in this flat. No kind of, very much a story of like survival and like getting ahead, and not at all a kind of sensibility around how we relate to the world. And she did a great job mothering me, I'll say that, but just like that was really not in my inheritance. And I remember being like a child and sitting on the balcony of our flat in London and hearing an owl, or I mean, I'm sure it wasn't an owl. I think it was probably a wood pigeon, but I thought it was an owl, and feeling like in complete communication with this owl. It would hoot, I would hoot back, it would hoot. It was like I was talking to a friend, except it was an animal. So I remember having those glimpses, you know, even in a culture that was really, really not at all encouraging of that. I guess we all have those little glimpses of right relationship. And actually, I'll tell you another story, which is, in fact, I think it was a wood pigeon. I was probably about 30. And at this point, I spent a decade in advertising. I was really, I'd really followed a path of consumerism. I was interested in a sort of a good life that was about myself and stuff and travel and experiences and feeling the effects of that, for sure. But that was very much, I'd sort of followed that path and that inheritance and gone into that life, and I was there for my early 20s and mid 20s. And then I had this moment when I was probably about 30 in lockdown, where I was living in a little flat on my own, and I had never grown anything or had any real relationship with plant life or the natural world at that stage. And I managed somehow on my window in lockdown to grow. I bought some tomato seeds, like a lot of people, bought some tomato seeds, and I planted them. And, they barely came up, and just about 2 little tomatoes kind of came up. And I was just so thrilled as if like I finally was doing something that I was meant to be doing my whole life. And I was so happy with these 2 little tomatoes. I put them in a little pot, and I had next to my window like a pigeon, a kind of like a pigeon, a very derelict kind of courtyard, which had become like a pigeon sanctuary, and was just full of pigeons, and they just lived there. And I'd sort of become quite friendly with them, I guess, in my mind. And I intuitively lay this pot out for them as like a gift. And I didn't really even think about what I was doing. I just knew I really wanted to like grow a thing and then pass it on to these pigeons outside my window. And I'd wake up in the morning and I'd check, and these two tiny measly tomatoes were still there, and then I'd wake up the next morning and they were still there, and on the third day they were gone, and I burst into tears. Like I was just like, it's like I'd had this first glimpse after 30 years of life of being in some very, very humble reciprocal relationship with the world. Just like a cycle had happened, and it was like an epiphany for me. I mean, it sounds stupid, from today's perspective, but that was like a glimmer, I guess, of right relationship for me.
Can you describe just that moment, like when you felt a rush of emotion? Because I was feeling it too when you were telling it to me. Can you just even sit with that for a moment longer?
Yeah. I think it's such a relief sometimes to return yourself to the loop, to be back in the entanglement that you're meant to be in, and in fact you always were in. You just pretended you weren't, or you believed the story that you weren't, and then you grow two very small tomatoes, and a pigeon says, "Yeah, okay, thanks," and it's just bliss for a moment. And at this point, I would have thought that my life had been very exciting in other ways, in terms of travel and glamour and having a fancy job or whatever. And I realized that had all just been like one category of life experience that was actually very small. Yeah.
I'm always just kind of, even just whether it was a wood pigeon or an owl, just the fact that they're even before maybe some of these thoughts or vocabulary or experiences had expanded upon, just how telling that felt. And it's almost like this feeling, I think, of presence as well. Like it's always there waiting for us. It doesn't take some, I think we've made these virtuous paths of how to come back into connection with things, but there's something so delightful, I think, about just the sheer availability of it.
Yeah, I love
Just
that.
from your perspective, just from that opening then of how do we come back or recover the capacity for this? How did this kind of continue to evolve on whatever front you want to go into, whether it's relationship with self or nature or community or whatever it might be?
Well, I mean, I'll say I'm interested in the word recovery from a few different angles. I've sort of mentioned, I guess, that my 20s were a time of disconnection and of being really embedded in the culture, that the kind of the harms of the culture, and also being someone who was out a lot and had unhealthy relationships, I'd say, um with keeping myself distracted, keeping myself, always drink in hand, always kind of unable, keeping myself from tuning in. And when I was about 29, I started experimenting with sobriety. So, with alcohol, and particularly cigarettes as well. I was just I was a smoker, like the smokers you meet in like the past, like yeah, the early 20th century. I was not a modern smoker. I just loved cigarettes. Anyway, I hope my mother doesn't listen to this. And I started experimenting with sobriety, and I read a book called, oh gosh, I wish I'd prepped this. I'm sort of slightly ad-libbing this now. It's a very famous book by Alan Carr, not the comedian Alan Carr, the other Alan Carr, about I will make you not smoke or whatever. It's got a very kind of, I will make you quit smoking. And I read that book. That was another epiphany for me, and actually that kind of unlocked a whole journey into kind of climate activism for me, which is, you do this book, which is a sort of it sort of is designed to sort of rewire your mind to stop smoking, but I just sort of don't want to spoil it for people in case they might be reading it. But it has this amazing element of ceremony at the end, where you are meant to take your last cigarette and like really in a very ritualistic kind of way, like have the last cigarette and then like declare yourself free on the other side. Like it's quite an unusual book, I think. And it instilled in me, like for the first time, this understanding that there was joy and freedom to be had when all of these crutches were removed, right? Like it wasn't like my life wasn't going to be compromised by no longer having alcohol in it. Like possibly I was going to be free from these desires. And that was like a huge switch for me, because I think I'd always assumed, as the culture helps us do, that we should be free to pursue those desires. Like freedom is pursuing all of our petty desires around the world and our various sort of, little attachments. And actually it was like a big paradigm shift to think it might be the other way around, and that I might have a more meaningful and a more interesting life on the other side of drinking, which I did massively. So there was something about that mechanic, I think, that was like, oh, I've misunderstood what these desires are for. These desires are not the big interesting life that I thought, that I get to consume stuff. It's the other side of that where things actually start to get really interesting. And so I guess for about a year I was quite deep in like the world of recovery and the language of sobriety and recovery, and what it means to recover what you left behind before all of those attachments and those addictions started to sort of play in your system. So I just say that because I think for me there is a lot to learn about. We talk a lot about recovery as a really personal journey, recovery from a kind of, obviously the sort of 12-step stuff is great, but it's quite, you are diseased and you have to work with this disease. Whereas the way I see it is like, this culture is trying to eat all of us, and we have to recover ourselves from this water we swim in. It's like, how do we build our own sort of sense of who we are in toxic waters? That's probably more how I see it.
Just curious from your perspective, because I remember what came up as you were speaking there. I remember a therapist suggesting to me it might be a good idea to lay off the booze while we're going through this process, and me looking at her almost going, in Ireland it's called St. Stephen's Day, in England it's called Boxing Day. And this was coming up in a couple of months where all my good friends come back from different parts of the world, and and I was just like, but what about Stephen's Day? This was the reason to hold on to something that was clearly impeding me and stifling my own development in many ways, like and kind of nursing that, I guess. But just curious from your perspective, how did one thing about sobriety, but how did you then start to feel the other things kind of fill in around that, or did things become instantly available to you?
Oh no, not at all. It was a long process. I mean, I think there was probably something about getting sober from alcohol that helped me understand what it feels like to get sober from stuff, right? Get sober from, from harmful sort of patterns and attitudes. But it was a lot of parallel work, actually. Interestingly, at the time I said, I think it was sort of 2020, I was very fortunate in the pandemic to be someone who was living alone, was 6 months sober, had discovered actually that they were way more introverted than they'd ever imagined, and then was kind of graced with 6 months locked in my flat finally reading books, which I hadn't done for 15 years, to like, so it felt like a really, for me, a very, very graced kind of like companion to recovery, really, to be able to like have a really like hermit like period of time where I could make sense of a lot of that other stuff. That's when the pigeons happened. And it's also when I started really, really engaging with climate and with, yeah, I guess like the inner work required of all of us to really stare climate and our other troubles in the face and like hold the gaze of what, of what we're learning about, the limits of our biosphere. And to me, there were really clear sort of personal parallels there, I guess, around consumption, and how do we start to live well without thinking that stuff is the path to getting there? Like what does it look like to live in right relationship in the earth, and to live sufficiently, and to have enough but not be seeking more? Like, I think I became very kind of personally invested in that question, having also at that point, spent a decade working in advertising, having been an instrument of that machine, creating manufacturing desire for cars and for alcohol. I did a lot of work with alcohol. So there were a lot of layers, I think, that were happening for me at like the very, very personal, and the sort of the professional, and more widely sort of the systemic and the planetary, and starting to understand what my role in the world might be as someone who had really been plugged into some of its most toxic qualities. Yeah.
It's so interesting, I find, that when we start pulling on a thread that maybe look like it's one specific line of inquiry, how a lot of other things seem to come into focus from that initial point.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then you can't really untangle them, or perhaps you can 3 years later, but in the moment you have no idea what you're doing, really.
Yeah, and just for you, because I think the case for alcohol, and especially from coming from Ireland, having lived in London, and there's some places that do it in a very in a very unhelpful way.
Yeah.
Just from your perspective, what was the kind of, how did your your lens kind of expand to then thinking around stuff and climate from that initial point?
Yeah, well, it's funny. I applied for an amazing leadership course, which I was fortunate to get a place on, which was really about supporting. It was run by a bunch of really radical and wonderful thinkers, but supporting people in the advertising industry to meaningfully engage with the climate and ecological emergency, whatever that meaningful engagement might look like and be. And I applied for it. I was 6 months sober, and in the application form, which I just reread by complete chance a couple of weeks ago, I had included a quote from Seneca, no memory of this, which was about, it was like, why are you interested in this? And I said, well, I'm just obsessed with this quote from Seneca, which is like, we must give up like all of our worldly things in order to live well. And I thought, oh, that's so interesting. I hadn't remembered that I'd made that connect. I was making that connection then. I was working out, probably with the help of my Bible, that quit smoking book. I was working out how to really begin a deep inquiry into this question of the good life, the alternative good life. That was not one of of ravenous consumption and of hunger. Not one of that like grasping hunger, but one that could be still, I think. So I just share that because I was kind of, I wouldn't have remembered that I was sort of making that connection then. But these things also happen, like there's something interesting with time here, I think, often, where it's like these things aren't really happening in sequence. They're sort of happening in multiple time horizons at the same time, and then you sometimes, if you have the privilege and you don't have, kids and a mortgage or whatever, you can follow your nose a little bit without really knowing why, and then sometime later you kind of know why.
That's actually a beautiful way to describe it in terms of how it resonates for me. Because until you actually started talking about that, although I don't think I was ever too crazy on consuming lots of stuff, I definitely noticed, whether if it was playing or exploring with alcohol consumption or meditation or whatever it may have been, my desire for stuff, especially when meaningful relationship has come into play, whether with myself or with other people, just how much that has kind of plummeted without it being
Mm,
a kind of renunciate act, if you know what I mean.
yeah.
Curious, just when you mentioned initially, like obviously the idea of sobriety and that, but what else after kind of reflecting on it now, like what else do you kind of get a sense of when you use this expression, kind of right relationship, even with yourself? How would you kind of describe that journey?
Well, it's a great question, and I will start with myself. I mean, I actually stumbled upon, well, first of all, I had the, again, excellent foresight, in my late 20s to start therapy, which is just, I think that was my future self giving a gift to my past self by just for some reason being like, you should do this now, and then in 8 years you'll be ready to have kids and be a person. So that was a wonderful, an absolutely wonderful and probably needed untangling for me of some of my inheritances. And I also became really, I became very devoted to the artist's way, which I'm sure you've had other people on your podcast who are quite into that, and in particular the practice of morning pages, which is, you get up and the first thing you do is you fill 3 pages with gobbledygook, whatever comes, to your pen, and I've actually been doing it religiously since 2019. So I am a real, less so now. I'm a mum, so it's a bit harder, but I am still an absolute devotee of the practice of morning pages because it just, well, it's a trail back to yourself. I think every morning, and it is such it is so countercultural, I think, to just hear yourself, force yourself to hear yourself dream, especially in a world of, you know, podcasts and kind of endless stimulation. And we really don't have to hear ourselves ever unless we force ourselves to. But there's another great week. This is sort of what, like a 9 or 10 week course, the Artist's Way, and there's one week, which I think and talk about a lot, which is maybe quite early, like week 4 maybe, where she forces you to, this is Julia Cameron, the author, to not consume any media, not read a single email, no TV, no reading books, like nothing at all. And to sit in the space of that and the shock of that, and then see what you start to make, because inevitably you're sat at home on a Tuesday night and you're not allowed to, it was written a long time ago, and now it is like inconceivable not to read an email for a week, right? But and we have to find our own way through that. But just as a challenge that forces you to hear yourself, it's like, I think it's such a gift to all of us. I wish for all of us we could be forced to do that a little bit. And I think I probably sensed that there was something needed in there for me, with my particular story, that having a discipline that was a daily return to myself was going to be something that was supportive. So there was a moment a few years later where I made the decision to go and do for a wilderness vigil, which is a sort of rites of passage, and sometimes it's called vision quests in other kind of communities. But essentially, you spend 4 days and 4 nights in the forest on your own, and you don't do anything at all. You just kind of sit there, and I guess Vipassana and other things have a sort of similar quality of just like the absolute like excruciating boredom, and what it feels like to get over the hump of that is, I think, a really necessary training, an initiatory kind of training for all of us in the world we live in. Our attention is so fragmented.
Can you describe what that hump was like within the wilderness?
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny because the thing when you talk about it with people, the thing that they get hooked on is that you don't eat for 4 days, and you're just drinking water, and everyone's like, oh my god, that's crazy, you must be so hungry. And every time my instinct is to be like, the food is the least of your worries. It really is, because the length of a day when you are sat, in an environment like that is just to watch the sun like go all the way over your head. But I say boredom, of course it's boring. And then on the other hand, unlike in a sort of Vipassana meditation or whatever, you're in the forest. There is so much going on. You're fully tuned into all this life, which again, the reason I did it was to I think repair some missing relationship developmentally for me with nature and the natural world. I knew there was probably a limit to my climate activism that stopped at like, I didn't really feel I belonged in the natural world. I was a bit scared of it. I just didn't have those childhood experiences growing up where you're running around fields and climbing trees. And so I had to do it in my adult. I had to return to that task, I think, in my adulthood, and it's a great way to do it. I'm really an advocate for people in cities having experiences like that in a way kind of break you. Felt a bit broken up by it, dissolved by it. Like by the end I was like, okay, I get it.
Yeah, but I think I don't know why that boredom intrigued me. I think I did a Vipassana once in the countryside outside of a city called Lucknow in India.
Yeah.
And I remember, people often talk so eloquently about them afterwards, and it always sounds a bit disingenuous to me to do
Yeah.
that. But I remember after the second day, the second night, I was just almost experiencing like a fever of anxiety to the point that the guy I was sharing a room with, like this was very basic stuff, like it was a plank of wood with a small cushion on top of it.
Yeah.
And he was probably in his late 60s. He didn't end up speaking any English when we could actually speak at the end. But he assumed from hearing me that I was actually shivering with cold, but I was actually just feeling so anxious. So he even brought over a blanket to me, which is gorgeous, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And at that point, I had visions of me roaming the countryside outside of Lucknow, like having escaped from the Vipassana with just a bed sheet wrapped around me. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not saying that everything just broke on the other side of that and life has been easy since,
Yeah.
but it does feel like a fundamental exercise to return to ourselves, to feel some, I don't know, just to get over all that charge and resistance from all our stimulation, from all the activity. And, as you describe, even in that week of a no email or internet or any content or whatever, like I find these things so liberating when we come into contact with them. Very curious, though, from your experience, how you would, I'm not trying to create a total line of demarcation between before and after this experience with nature, but can you give me a sense even of what that experience or those 4 days started to do to your relationship or your sense of ease within nature?
Yeah. And yeah, just to sort of speak to your Vipassana experience. I love that because like boredom is just not an emotion that we associate with like intensity. It's like kind of listless, and actually, yeah, I love that, like absolute like acute intent, like panic. I'm panicking, which is really is a funny thing to experience. And I know that feeling. Yeah, look, I mean the 4 days. It was. I'm interested in the work of the mythologist Martin Shaw, and one of the things he says about these kinds of processes is that Western civilization is 3 days deep, and on the fourth day, you're back to being a mammal in the forest, which is what you're meant to be. And I love that. I feel like that was true to my experience of being there. I think after the third day, you've run out of civilization. Like you're just scrabbling around and sort of quite feral, and in all kinds of relationship with all kinds of animals, and also some ancestors are coming and getting their word in, and some future descendants have got something to say, and there is a whole web that suddenly makes itself slightly available. So I carried, you're right, of course it's not a sort of clear before and after, but I carried a feeling of that web. And then I also carried a couple of other strange things. I had this weird I had some animal encounters and interesting things, but actually one of the kind of the primary felt experiences for me at the time was like I was in a sort of beautiful glade. I was in a glade really, where if you were like a big mammal, like a stag, you would want to come and rest there. Like this would be a good resting place. And I developed this sort of very strange paranoia that a wounded stag was going to come in to my glade and I wouldn't know how to help it die. Like I was just like, I hope that doesn't happen. Like, oh my God, if it happens, how am I going to accompany it into death? And I was haunted by that. It didn't happen, fortunately, and life went on, but it was like a new line of inquiry just popped up in that glade, which was like, how do I help things die well? What if I need to build my competency as a person who accompanies death? And I thought about that for about 6 months, and then I went and did the death doula training with the Living Well, Dying Well Institute in the UK, and then that unraveled a whole new thread, which is I'm still sort of making sense of. But sometimes these questions just pop up, and it maybe takes those 3 days getting scrubbed away of Western civilization until you're like, oh, this is actually what's really preoccupying me, and what I think maybe some of my work to do in the world is.
I'd love to, just even if it's still not very settled or clear, just hear more about that inquiry around how do I help things die well. I
Yeah.
think there's so many facets to it, right?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so many. Yeah. And that was a few years ago. So since then it has become a big thread of my work. I'm involved in a range of things kind of to do with that now. But yeah, it's so funny. It's just that feeling of like, oh God, what if I'm inadequate in this setting? Like I have to make sure that I can rise to the occasion of death, or to that threshold. I want to make sure that I'm spiritually able to hold that space. And I've just, again, no mortgage, no kids. This was a period of life where I was like, I'll go and do the doula training. It's like that's a privilege for those kind of moments to happen at the right time in life and not have to get put off for 18 years or whatever is a great gift. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I went to do this training, and at that point, I'd been in climate for a few years, and I was holding some of the bigger questions around like, in many ways we're living in a dying time. there are many of these stories that we're living with which are expired and are over. And I see, with looking at kind of how corporates are behaving and how hard it is to just like stop working with a fossil fuel client or whatever, it's like we don't seem to have a good capacity for holding endings. We just don't, on many levels, right? Like we each other's losses, but also these kind of big endings which are coming or have already come, and we're just living with the lag of them. So anyway, I'll tell you a story which doesn't reflect super well on me, but I went to the doula training, and it was it's quite an NHS kind of tea and biscuits atmosphere in the doula training, and a lot of people have care backgrounds or kind of nursing backgrounds, and we did a kind of opening circle, which was like, why are you here and what draws you to this? And like high on my sort of soul journey or whatever, and I was like, I just, how are we going to hold the great dying? Like, I'm here to like be the doula of the great dying, and I just, it was a very humbling moment, because obviously all these nurses were just like, who the hell are you? And it was great, I was like, oh, I've said the wrong thing. This is not that. But it was good, because it really, my job there was to learn how to be an end of life carer to a human person, and then later go and extract whatever wisdom principles and apply them in different ways and play with them. But like at that moment, that was what I was a student of. And I just now I would be a little bit closer to, it's an incredibly pompous thing to say anyway, but I get a bit more what I was talking about than I did at the time.
Yeah, but I think there's something, when I look back on several moments, and I'm sure there's stuff I can look back on in 5 years' time that I'll look back on now and I go, oh, you did that again. But I think you can still see the shred of truth within it as well, and then acknowledge for me, like sometimes some wild spiritual directives or egos that like, I'm very grateful to some people in my life that have stayed with me through that,
Yeah. And it's, that's what being young is. You have to get tempered by the world a bit. It's good to have some direction and fire, and then learn that you were, an idiot later. It's fun. It's part of it.
For your sake then, like when you do go through that process, I'm not trying to be too kind of cute with the question of then like how might you help the stag, but in any which way, like what do you think you got a sense from that in terms of an encounter with death and I know you use the expression rising to the moment of it as such, but what do you sense you drew from that experience?
Well, I think it drew attention to actually a very formative moment in my early 20s that I hadn't quite understood to be significant, which was I was briefly an end of life carer for my grandmother, who was in Poland, and I think I said before, very sparse family. So she was kind of alone in Poland, and then my mother and I were here in the UK, and there wasn't really anyone else. So my mother and I ended up sort of taking shifts, flying back and forth to look after her for 2 weeks at a time. And I was 21, and I was busy, with I had other stuff going on. I just graduated. I wanted to move to Berlin, blah, 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 go to India. And I did it. And it was, there was no question that I wasn't going to do it. But in some ways I really didn't have I didn't know how to be with her. I didn't, I just, we were back and forth from hospitals. It was much, much more, it wasn't like the UK. I was injecting her, I was changing nappies. It was very, very visceral and very, very much like being with a dying person, and she was really scared as well. She was not at peace with her dying. And I didn't know how to talk to her about that. And so I did everything on paper, and then in other ways I didn't really accompany her, as she should have been accompanied. So, and then there was a funeral. She died actually while I was flying home, and my mother had just flown back out. And a week later was her funeral, and I was going to fly back out again. And the night before, I just got so drunk. I went out with my friends and lost my purse and my bag, and woke up in someone's house and realized I had to go to this funeral of my grandmother, of my second carer of my life, really. And by some kind of miracle orchestrated by the gods, the flight was 2 hours late. Something appeared in the middle of, some man gave me a tenner. I got to the airport, just complete grace. And I was there, and it was, it was all fine. But I knew later with the stag that I had had an experience that was so insufficient to the moment and to the profundity of that threshold, really. And I don't really blame myself. I was just a person who was in the culture, but I think on some level I was like, that must never happen again. It is really important to me in my life to be someone who can rise to the biggest moments, like those moments of like threshold or real awe or real risk, or like it pains me to imagine that I might not meet a moment like that, and I need to train now, in a way. So I think part of it was that as well. Yeah.
There's I don't know, I think there's a beauty to how our paths are shaped from what's gone before it, you know what I mean? And just I don't mean that we have to earn something from things, but just the redemptive quality of life, or the availability of life, or the accessibility
Yeah.
of still engaging with the past by what we do right now. And I don't know, I just think it's one of the more beautiful things in life to engage with, rather than a thrashing of, or just
Yeah.
leaving it be and burying it. And I think it's from how you're describing your own process. There's so many moments where you're giving yourself the space to come into right relationship even with the past. Do you know what I mean? Which I think there's many times during this conversation you've kind of touched on something in the realms of time and our
Yeah.
relationship to.
Yeah.
Curious, just from your perspective, how, when you think of this sense of capacity for these relationships, you mentioned towards the end of that, at the opening, just around the sacred and the divine. Just interested in your path in that particular sense.
Yeah. Um, that's another question I don't think anyone has ever really asked me. It's a great question. I wish we all asked that question, actually. Um, well, I would say I have no religious thing. um, Although, like you, Irish, Polish, Catholic inheritance, but not with much meaning for me. I'm very. I have glimpses, I think, sometimes of what feels like the divine, or like what feels like devotion, maybe. Um, I guess I can give an example. Like I've had a couple of like either dreams or moments where I've absolutely encountered like the beauty of things and the incredible majesty of aliveness in like a second, or a moment. And then life carries on and you just think, oh, there it is, there's like, I don't know what it is. It's I certainly don't have a sort of a good language for it, but I am deeply deeply curious about how to make space for it in my life, and it feels true to me more than ever, really, that this is a dimension that is available to us in some way. I had a sort of dream or something, I guess, a while ago, which was maybe sort of illustrative of this. And in the dream, I was holding this orb, like a shiny silver orb, and I was in a forest and I was with someone else. And the feeling of holding this orb was like the bliss of just like all of life's joys, like rolled up into one. Just like the touching of this orb was just everything. And the guy next to me was like, oh, this is great. You really like this orb. Like, this is great. And I was like, yeah, I do. Wow. This is an extraordinary experience. And he was like, we need to package this up. What do we call it? What do we call it? Magical eco tours. And in my dream, I remember just this feeling of like absolute fury that this advertising presence had come in to try and word this thing again, like, and that's probably a good story of the tension of a lot of my life, or maybe a lot of all of our lives, which is like in this world, which is designed to come and like turn the orb into a magical eco tour, the package price and margins. How do you recover? How do you recover the orb itself?
I find this is coming up more and more. Is there's almost like an earned simplicity to this life, that is on the other side of kind of staring some of this complexity or difficult things in the face. And it's not to say that suddenly relating with everyone just becomes a piece of piss and
Yes.
it's so easy
Yeah.
to do. Like
Yeah.
there's still so many moments where I'm caught in my own humanity, or even made aware of the fragility of my integrity. At the same time, I can still look at it, or at the same time, I'm still completely aware of moments of awe, which, as you kind of described there, it doesn't have to be this perpetual sense of enlightenment as I go through a day. It's just like, wow, I just experienced that again. And even as you were describing the orb there, it's like, it's a it's a beautiful concept. And then at the same time, if I am in a moment of awe or that's some sort of connection, it is that. It is literally, there's nothing else in that
Yeah.
one particular moment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just given some of the directions of your work, and also just some of your inquiries into specifically around a good life, and even your work in the 2030 context of that. Curious as to what you're discovering and where that's kind of taking you.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, I mean, you touched on, I've had this inquiry with my organization for a few years now around, if the good life isn't that, or isn't the stuff-centered good life, what is it? And what are people dreaming of? And we've done a bunch of research over the last few years in the UK and Ireland, and the answer is, well, the answer is always the same. The answer is always like, on some level, more connection with ourselves, with others, with nature. So that won't surprise you, and I'm sure it won't surprise many, many people. But what I'd find really curious about it is actually that we have a sort of particular research methodology around tracking the imaginations of people. I'm particularly interested in imagination as a faculty, and dreaming of this future life. Maybe it's not right now, but in 10 years time, or in 8 years time, what is the texture of your day if it's a good day? Like, what is it smell and feel like? How do you sort of inhabit that? And so I've thought a lot about how we access people's imaginations beyond their like thinking mind, predictive mind. Well, hopefully they'll have sorted out, Iran or whatever. Like, not that, the thing underneath that, the imaginative vision. But what I've noticed over the last few years is that vision, the scale and the color of that vision seems to be shrinking a little bit. People used to say bigger things, like, I'd love to just, pack it in and start baking full time, or, maybe we could have chickens, or sort of some leaps of imagination were happening. And then, a few years later, everything was a little bit scaled down. And a few years after that, it was more like, I hope our debt doesn't get worse. Or like, I hope things don't get worse at school. It was suddenly like the good life was an absence of decline, rather than anything bigger and dreamier. And I think that is, mirrored by what people are talking about with this kind of imagination crisis or imagination recession, that there is something in our system at the moment which is causing anxiety, unprocessed trauma, grief, all kinds of stuff are getting stuck in us, and it is shrinking our capacity to dream, just at the moment where we need to. We really need to hold on to that like deep vision. And it feels, it feels very challenging. There is a paralysis, I think, around imagination and the sort of the horizon of what's possible at the moment. And partly that's actually, not to sort of retrofit some of my inquiry, but I think that's partly also why this question of like being with loss, being with grief, being with death, metabolizing those losses better feels so alive to me, and like such a critical companion to the work of like imagining the good life, imagining a better good life. It's like, okay, yeah, we have to also dream a lot of other stuff out of being, and we have to hospice it well, help it go with grace.
I just love the focus on imagination, and while you were speaking though, just also how clear in your own path to what you've been sharing of how much more space you've created for the capacity to imagine. The whether it's the letting go of alcohol, whether it's the creating time for just the morning pages, a week without any content, the wilderness experience, like so many things where it's just, I think we're in such grave need of space for our minds, for our hearts, for our souls, even, I'd say. But having listened to all of that, Ali, I'm really interested to hear your response to the question of what is a good life for you.
Oh my goodness. I think I have to come back to, what I've been circling around here. This question of being in ever more right relationship, with myself, with my community, with my world, and I think with the sacred, I will say that. So yeah, spirals of ever more right relationship, whatever on earth that means. That's my answer for you.
And just in terms of that, could you give me a sense of what might some of the hallmarks be of that in whatever realm that may be?
Well, look, I mean, from a deep sense of belonging to my place is one. I'm like on baby steps with that. We've just been claimed, I think, by a place, but I really hope in a good life for me will look like becoming deeply entangled in this place, where I am in the UK, and learning how to be in conversation with it, rather than just sitting on top of it, so that would be one example of a sort of a spiral I hope will happen over the course of my life, and in in relationship to my world, to my natural world. Yeah.
Ali, I've deeply enjoyed this conversation. I think you're sharing so many fascinating areas for people to explore or think about themselves. And as is always my preference, it's coming from an experience and then obviously one form of experiences that have shaped you as your life moves forward. So I'm so grateful to speak to you today on the What is a Good Life podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.